The damp, freezing air of the Reichswald forest in February 1945 did little to cool the anxiety of Hauptmann Hoffmann as he surveyed the perimeter of his artillery battery. It was a silence that felt heavier than the roar of battle, the kind of quiet that in the late stages of the war had become a harbinger of doom for German gunners. Hoffmann was a veteran, a man who had seen the shifting tides of the conflict, but nothing had prepared the Wehrmacht for the invisible noose that had tightened around their artillery corps over the last 2 years. As the British bombardment lifted, a deceptive peace settled over the scarred tree line, and Hoffmann signaled his crews to emerge from their reinforced bunkers. The doctrine was clear, drilled into them from the early victories of 1939. Return fire immediately to disrupt the enemy's infantry. Advance. It was a standard tactical response, a reflex of a military machine that still believed in its own lethality. His 4 guns roared to life, sending shells screaming toward British lines, a defiance that felt necessary, perhaps even brave. Hoffmann checked the time, the sweep of the second hand marking the moments of their survival. 3 minutes passed. The air remained still. Then, without the warning of ranging shots, without the gradual creep of an adjusting barrage, the world simply disintegrated. It was not a gradual destruction, but an instantaneous erasure. British heavy shells descended not merely near the battery, but directly into the gun pits, a thunderous, coordinated arrival of high explosives that turned the earth into a churning maelstrom of steel and fire. In 40 seconds, Hoffmann's command ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The survivors, dazed and deafened, crawled through the wreckage of what had been a precision instrument of war. When Hoffmann later sat down to write his after-action report, a document that would survive to be read by his captors, he penned a single sentence that acted as an epitaph for the German artillery arm. They located our guns before we fired twice. This was not the lament of a man beaten by luck or overwhelmed by sheer numbers. It was the recognition of a technological disparity so vast it seemed like sorcery. The British were not guessing. They were not carpeting the grid square in hopes of hitting something. They were hunting with a mathematical precision that German science, for all its vaunted reputation, could no longer match. The mechanism of this defeat was sound. Specifically, the weaponization of acoustics through a system known as sound ranging, a technology that had matured from a crude experiment in the First World War into a decisive, war-winning capability by 1944. The British had deployed a network of ears across the war European theater that transformed every German muzzle blast into a death warrant. The reality was stark. British sound ranging systems could pinpoint the location of a hostile battery to within 25 to 50 meters in less than 5 minutes. It was a loop of detection, calculation, and retribution that moved faster than a German battery could reload. This capability had fundamentally altered the psychology of the German soldier. Captured field orders from the period reveal a paralyzing fear that had seeped into the highest levels of command. Directives explicitly forbade batteries from firing alone during quiet periods, particularly when the wind blew from the east, carrying the sound toward British lines. The Wehrmacht army, built on the doctrine of aggressive, overwhelming firepower, was ordering its artillery to remain silent rather than risk the inevitable counter-battery fire. This was the definition of tactical paralysis. To understand how a microphone defeated a howitzer, one must look at the specific engineering challenges of acoustic detection. When a piece of artillery fires, it generates a complex acoustic signature. There is the crack of the shell, the sonic boom created as the projectile breaks the sound. Bury on the thump of the muzzle blast, a low-frequency pressure wave generated by the expanding gases at the gun's breech. For human ears and early detection systems, the high-frequency crack of the shell was the most prominent sound, but it was useless for locating the gun itself because it emanated from the projectile's flight path, not its origin. The solution came from an unassuming lance corporal named William Sansom Tucker, who in 1916 invented the hot wire microphone. Tucker's genius was in recognizing that the information lay in the low-frequency muzzle blast, a sound wave oscillating at a mere 10 to 25 hertz, often below the threshold of human hearing, but capable of traveling great distances and diffracting over terrain obstacles. Tucker's device was a masterpiece of physics applied to warfare. It consisted of a platinum wire, heated by an electrical current, suspended inside a canister. The canister was designed as a Helmholtz resonator, tuned specifically to resonate with the low-frequency thump of a gun firing, while ignoring the high-pitched crack of the shell or the chatter of machine gun fire. When the low-frequency pressure wave hit the canister, it caused a minute oscillation of air across the wire, cooling it slightly. This cooling changed the wire's electrical resistance, which caused a flicker in the galvanometer connected to it. It was a system of elegant filtration. The microphone essentially ignored the battle noise and listened only for the specific signature of enemy artillery. By World War II, this system had been integrated into a sophisticated network involving improved recording equipment, often using heat-sensitive teledaltos paper to instantly visualize the sound waves, removing the delay of developing photographic film. The deployment of this technology was industrial in scale. A British sound ranging section would lay out a line of 6 microphones in a shallow arc spanning roughly 4 to 7 kilometers of the front. These microphones were surveyed with geodetic precision. When a German gun fired, the muzzle wave would ripple outward, reaching each of the 6 microphones at slightly different times, measured in hundredths of a second. These time differences were the raw data. Back at the command post, operators would feed these time intervals into a plotting system. By calculating the hyperbolic intersection of the time differences, they could triangulate the origin of the sound. The math was complex, involving corrections for wind speed, air temperature, and barometric pressure, all of which affected the speed of sound. Yet, less seasoned British crews could produce a grid coordinate within 3 to 5 minutes of the German gun firing. This speed was the killer. In the time it took a German crew to verify their own fall of shot and adjust aim, the British survey regiment had already identified their position, relayed the coordinates to a counter-battery officer, and assigned a battery or sometimes an entire regiment to neutralize the target. The result was a terrifying asymmetry. A German battery commander knew the statistics: fire 2 rounds and expect incoming mail before the third leaves the tube. This created a battlefield environment where the German artillery, traditionally the backbone of their defensive strategy, became a liability. To fire was to die. This was not merely an inconvenience. It was the dismantling of combined arms warfare. Without artillery support, German infantry were left exposed to Allied advances. Without the ability to suppress Allied attacks, German defensive lines crumbled. The proof of this dominance was found in the desperate adaptations the Germans attempted. By 1944, the standard German artillery doctrine of establishing surveyed, permanent positions for accurate, predicted fire had been largely abandoned. In its place, they adopted shoot-and-scoot tactics. A battery would roll into a temporary position, fire a maximum of 3 rounds, and then immediately flee before the inevitable British response arrived. While this kept some crews alive, it destroyed their effectiveness. Artillery requires stability and calculation to be accurate. Rushing into a field, firing hastily, and running away meant German fire was often inaccurate and uncoordinated. Furthermore, the Germans began shifting away from conventional tube artillery entirely, favoring mortar and the terrifying Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. These weapons had shorter ranges, but higher trajectories, making them slightly harder to locate with sound ranging, and they were more mobile. However, this shift was a strategic admission of defeat. Mortar could not provide the deep interdiction or the sustained heavy barrages of 150mm howitzer. The Germans were not choosing these weapons because they were better. They were choosing them because their conventional artillery had been rendered obsolete by British microphones. Perhaps the most damning indictment of German artillery engineering and doctrine came from the sands of North Africa. In the open desert, where the acoustic conditions were ideal and the lines of sight vast, the disparity became undeniable. Reconnaissance battalions of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions began rejecting their own stamp ad issue weaponry in favor of captured British 25-pounder field guns. At the height of the Desert War, German formations were fielding dozens of these captured guns, effectively integrating them into their order of battle. This was not a matter of shortages. It was a matter of preference. German crews found the British guns, with their 360-degree traversing platforms and rapid-fire capabilities, superior to their own, but more importantly, the integration of these guns highlighted a respect for British engineering that contradicted the propaganda of the Reich. When an army steals the enemy's weapons to replace its own, the debate over technological superiority is effectively over. The German soldiers' experience of British artillery fire in this theater gave rise to the myth of the automatic cannon. Prisoners captured in North Africa, and later in Normandy, frequently asked their captors to see the automatic artillery batteries. They had become convinced that the British possessed a fully automated weapon system. To the German observer, the British fire seemed supernatural. There were no ranging shots, no slow adjustments. The shells simply arrived, on target, in a deluge. This was the result of predicted fire. The ability of British surveyors to map the Earth so precisely, and calibrate their guns so perfectly to atmospheric conditions, that they could fire for effect immediately, without needing to walk the shells onto the target. When combined with sound ranging data that provided the exact location of the enemy, the result was a bombardment that felt computerized long before the age of computers. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was acutely aware of this imbalance. His papers and reports to Berlin are a litany of frustrations regarding Allied artillery superiority. He described battles in North Africa and Italy as hopeless due to the volume and accuracy of enemy fire. Rommel noted that German counterattacks were frequently broken up and dispersed by artillery, alone before they could even reach Allied lines. In Italy, he wrote of the enemy's tremendous superiority, a phrase that signaled a fundamental inability to compete. The British had turned artillery from a support weapon into an interdiction force that dictated the tempo of the battle. The Germans could not mass forces for an attack because the sound ranging and flash spotting teams would detect the preparatory activity, and the British guns would smash the assembly areas. This dominance culminated in operations like Operation Veritable in the Reichswald in 1945. Lieutenant General Sir Brian Hoare, commanding the 30th Corps, utilized a pepper-pot strategy that relied entirely on the supremacy of his survey regiments. At the start of the operation, every gun on the Corps' front opened fire on known German positions. This massive initial shock forced the Germans into their bunkers. Then, silence. The British stopped firing. The Germans, trained to man their weapons as soon as a barrage lifted, rushed to their guns to repel the expected infantry assault, but there was no assault. Instead, the British sound-ranging bases were listening. As the German batteries opened up, thinking they were fighting off an attack, the microphones plotted their positions. Minutes later, the British fire resumed, this time targeting the specific coordinates of the active German guns. The trap was perfect. The German crews were caught in the open, driven, manning their weapons, and were annihilated. Horrocks later noted that the leading British troops met practically no resistance in the initial phase. The German defensive crust had been hollowed out by sound ranging and ballistics. The intellectual capital behind this system was as impressive as the combat results. It was led by men like William Lawrence Bragg, an Australian-born physicist and the youngest ever Nobel laureate. Bragg, along with Charles Galton, Darwin grandson of the evolutionary biologist, applied the rigorous scientific method to the chaotic environment of the battlefield. They did not view artillery as a brute force instrument but as a physics problem to be solved. They analyzed wind gradients, temperature inversions, and the geomorphology of the Western Front. This scientific approach extended to the structure of the British Army itself. By the end of the war, Britain fielded 11 dedicated survey regiments. These were not ad hoc units, but specialized formations composed of sound, rangers, flash spotters, and surveyors. They were the intellectual nervous system of the Royal Artillery, providing the data that made the guns effective. The legacy of this system extended far beyond the fall of Berlin. The principles established by Tucker and Bragg became the foundation of modern counter-battery warfare. The triangulation methods, the understanding of atmospheric acoustics, and the integration of sensor data into fire control loops remained standard practice through the Cold War, eventually evolving into the radar and computer-controlled systems of today. But the raw effectiveness of the World War II system remains a testament to a specific moment in military history where science outpaced tactics. The Germans, stuck in a doctrine of visual observation and permanent positions, were fighting an enemy who could see with sound and strike from beyond the horizon. Ultimately, the statistics of the war tell the story that the German High Command tried to suppress. British survey regiments located approximately 20,000 enemy battery positions across Italy and northwest Europe. They destroyed a significant percentage of the German artillery park, not in duels of visual sighting, but in calculated executions from miles away. The 25 to 50 meter accuracy of the sound-ranging bases meant that there was no safety for a German gunner. The 50 captured 25-pounders in the Afrika Korps were a silent admission that the tools of the Empire were superior. But the most haunting evidence remains the words of the men who faced it. The German prisoners who spoke of automatic cannons, the officers who wrote of their fear of firing when the wind was from the east, and Hauptmann Hoffmann, standing in the ruins of his battery in the Reich, realizing that the war had changed. He had fired twice. The British had done the rest. It was a victory of waves and wires, of physics and patience, proving that in the modern age, to be heard was to be seen, and to be seen was to be destroyed. The disparity in counter-battery capabilities also reveals a deeper truth about the organizational cultures of the opposing forces. The Wehrmacht, often lauded for its operational flair and the tactical initiative of its NCOs, struggled to integrate high-level scientific concepts into standardized routine across the entire force. While Germany produced brilliant scientists and advanced weapons like the V-2 rocket or the jet engine, these were often wonder weapons detached from the day-to-day reality of the infantry and artillery. In contrast, the British Army, and by extension the Commonwealth forces of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, excelled at the systemic application of science to the mundane grid of warfare. Sound ranging wasn't a wonder weapon. It was a bureaucratic, logistical, and scientific process that was replicated consistently across hundreds of miles of fronts. It required telephone lines to be laid and maintained under fire, specialized printing paper to be distributed to muddy dugouts, and mathematically literate operators to sit in trucks calculating hyperbolus while the world exploded around them. The British success was not just in inventing the Tucker microphone, but in building an organization that could use it reliably, day after day, in rain, snow, and desert heat. This reliability forced a regression in German capabilities. As the war dragged on into 1944 and 1945, the German war machine, crumbling under the weight of Allied logistics and air power, also suffered an intellectual degradation on the battlefield. The shift to mortar was practical, yes, but it was also a reversion to shorter range, less accurate fire. It meant the Wehrmacht lost the ability to strike deep into the British rear areas. They could harass the front line, but they could not disrupt the supply columns, the assembly areas, or the command posts situated 5 or 10 miles back. The British Sound Rangers had effectively created a safe zone behind their own lines, a sanctuary where the logistical buildup for victory could proceed unmolested by German heavy guns. This strategic asymmetry is often overlooked in favor of discussions about tanks or aircraft, but it was the silence of the German long-range guns enforced by the threat of instant destruction that allowed the Allies to build the overwhelming material advantage that crushed the Third Reich. The Commonwealth contribution to this victory was integral. The Canadians, under leaders like Andrew McNaughton, had pioneered counter-battery innovation as far back as Vimy Ridge in 1917, establishing a lineage of excellence that carried directly into the Second World War. The 2nd Canadian Survey Regiment operated seamlessly alongside British units, and their meteorological units provided the crucial atmospheric data needed for accurate predicted fire. Similarly, the Australians and New Zealanders brought a rugged pragmatism and scientific acuity to the survey regiments in North Africa and the Pacific. Lawrence Bragg himself, the architect of the system, was a product of Adelaide, symbolizing the shared intellectual effort of the Empire. It was a multinational collaboration of minds focused on a singular problem: how to kill the enemy's guns. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, Rhine, the psychological victory over the German artillery was absolute. The German gunners were defeated not just by high explosives, but by the certainty of their own vulnerability. Every time a German officer looked at his map and decided not to order a fire mission, the British system was working. Every time a battery commander ordered his men to pack up and move, after only a few rounds, sacrificing accuracy for survival, the British system was working. The silence of the German guns was the loudest testament to the success of British sound ranging. It was a war of attrition won by the side that could turn the very physics of the battlefield against its enemy, transforming the sound of resistance into the coordinates of defeat.